Welcome back to The Overlook. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and in today's episode, we have a lot to look at coming out of Trump's visit to the Middle East, what some of his rhetoric might signal about his second administration's policy towards the region, as well as the release of American-Israeli hostage Idan Alexander and what that means for the region, the war between Israel and Gaza, the U.S. alliance with Israel, and how that fits into Trump's second term policy, and if it does at all. Last week, we also saw the Trump administration reach a deal, an agreement with the Houthis over its terror in the Red Sea. That deal did exclude Israel, as well as the UK, which has been helping the United States fight the Houthis in the region for the last year and a half. Before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe to the Philos Project channel. You can also follow us on X and Instagram, as well as my X handle, which will be linked in the description box down below. So probably the most controversial thing to come out of Trump's Middle East visit is the plane that was gifted to him by Qatar, a $400 million plane that will be accepted officially by the United States and be retrofitted to serve as the United States Air Force One. And then the plan is after that, the plane would be donated to the Trump Library Foundation. There's a lot of questions over the constitutional legality of that. And I have some of my own opinions just on the role of Qatar. Again, at the top of the episode, I mentioned that there seems to be a shift in President Trump's rhetoric when it comes to the region. And I fear that a lot of that is influenced by the isolationist in his camp. I've talked a lot about the division between the MAGA party with MAGA 1.0 versus MAGA 2.0. 1.0 kind of being your staunch realist, discouraging war abroad, but of course being a staunch ally to Israel and not afraid to use force if needed. And then we have the isolationists who seem to be favoring a Middle East that's not focused on Israel and that alliance, as well as increased cooperation, but not through military strategy, but economic, e-commerce, and trade. Okay, so before I even get into today's episode, because I feel like I have to justify my critique of this Qatari plane and Trump's shift, which I am slightly disheartened by when looking at his rhetoric, and we'll get into that, but that I am a supporter of President Trump. I've been pretty upfront with that here on my podcast. And if you've listened to me or read between the lines of some of the things I've talked about, I've been transparent on where my own personal political views lie. Now, with that, I think it's fair to hold President Trump or any president, Republican or Democrat, up to the same standard. And just like I had a lot of critiques for the Biden administration, I can still hold critiques for President Trump's policies, even though I support him and his administration. I think we've emerged at this critical point here in the United States and in our politics where there's a cult of personalities for political leaders, and you either staunchly support everything a political leader does and you condemn everything that the opposite party or political opponents represent. And there's an inability to look inward and critique policies within one's own camp. I think we saw this during the Biden years as well as now with the current Trump administration. But I just feel a need to justify myself in saying I have concerns over the influence and role of Qatar, as well as the shift from focusing on Israel and normalizing Arab nations with Israel in the region, which was the legacy of the Abraham Accords and Trump's first presidential administration. I have my MAGA hats here to prove that I am a supporter of Trump, because I already know that there's going to be a lot of comments in the comment section. Here's my badge from the inauguration and the ball. I grew up in a very MAGA house, which is why I also feel very passionately about encouraging dialogue within the MAGA movement when it comes to foreign policy and the region. So with that apology and background of my own personal political views, let's get into today's episode. So there appears to be a shift, and myself and many people in this space who have been talking about the rise of isolationism on the Republican right have seen this shift happening slowly over the last year and a half, even before Trump took office. And I think one of the fears was that the Tucker Carlsons and even Donald Trump Jr., who seems to be at least anti-war. Obviously, everyone is anti-war, but adopting some of this isolationist rhetoric popularized by Tucker Carlson, and then we've even seen with Joe Rogan, influencing the president's rhetoric. So this is a tweet from when Trump first came into office. This was within his first month, I believe. Yeah, this was in March. And this is when President Trump met with some of the hostages who were released. And I quote his tweet, "I am sending Israel everything it needs to finish the job. Not a single Hamas member will be safe if you don't do as I say. Release the hostages now, or there will be hell to pay later. President Donald J. Trump." So this was back in March of 2025. And we saw the president also tweeting something to the effect of, "Shalom means hello and goodbye in Hebrew. Hamas, you choose. Release the hostages or else." He said the same thing before even taking office, was release the hostages or else day one of my presidency, you will have all hell to pay. And we've seen a lack of follow through from that rhetoric. Bibi Netanyahu came to the White House within the first month. There was a very strong front for the U.S.-Israel alliance within the first 100 days, the first month of President Trump's second term. And of course, that is a legacy from his first term, which rebuked radicalization and Islamism in the region. Under President Trump, ISIS was eliminated. And the Abraham Accords were historic because it hinged on Arab nations recognizing the state of Israel, which they have refused to do since its founding in 1948. It wasn't just a strategic alliance brokered by the U.S. with shared security interests. It involved normalizing the region towards Israel and a Middle East with Israel at its center, being a major and key ally of the West, and particularly the United States. But there seems to be a bit of a shift. So President Trump went to Qatar this week. He also went to Saudi Arabia. He was welcomed with great shows of respect. And he made a speech in Saudi Arabia, I think, outlining what his second term's foreign policy in the region is going to be. This is his speech at the Saudi U.S. Investment Forum. And he rebuked Iranian aggression. He took a really hard line with Iran, so that has not changed, although he did shy away from any rhetoric that implicated or promised direct U.S. military action. He essentially just said that Iran would have to pay if they threatened the U.S. or our allies and our interests in the region. But there was an emergence of this isolationist rhetoric. At the 19-minute mark, President Trump said, "Instead, the birth of a modern Middle East has been brought by the people of the region themselves, the people that are right here." So he's speaking against this Bush-era foreign policy, which sought to rebuild or even build the Middle East from foreign intervention and to craft countries like Iraq and Afghanistan into beacons of Western democracy, which was an absolute failure. And so President Trump is speaking about that. So he's saying that the region, particularly Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, which of course is positioned different. The Gulf states have Gulf oil money, which also helps with state building in ways that other Middle Eastern countries don't have the benefit of. But he's making a really clear point here, which is that it's not because of foreign intervention, it's because of the people who live here. The people that are here, the people that have lived here all their lives, developing your own sovereign countries, pursuing your own unique visions, and charting your own destinies in your own way. It's really incredible what you've done. In the end, these so-called nation builders, that Bush-era policy, wrecked far more nations than they built. And the interventionalists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves. They told you how to do it, but they had no idea how to do it themselves. Peace, prosperity, and progress ultimately came not from a radical rejection of your heritage, but rather from embracing your national traditions and embracing the same heritage that you love so dearly, and it's something only you could do. You achieved a modern miracle, the Arabian way. That's a good way. Okay, so I don't disagree. I think a lot of people would reject the Bush-era foreign policy as being neo-colonialist, as an extreme of Jacksonian foreign policy. Even your average MAGA voter, I think, would agree on that. But this sounds very similar to what Tucker Carlson has been saying for the last year and a half, which is this other extreme of rejecting any sort of U.S. presence abroad and allowing other nations to build. And of course, that is a good concept. But when positioned in the Middle East, you see a lot of Islamist organizations trying to undermine even the countries that they live in's right to self-determine. And so ideally in a peaceful Middle East, yes, every nation would have the right to sovereignly build their own societies, their own economies, their own political infrastructure on their own. But this speech largely ignored the role of radical Islamists. And to point out that Qatar is one of the largest funders of radical jihad and Islamist organizations across the region, including Hamas. So we're seeing a shift. We're seeing a lot of isolationist rhetoric here. And again, that is even different from how President Trump talked about the region in his first administration. In his speech, he also talked about a deal with the Houthis, which I mentioned at the top of the hour. So the United States engaged unilaterally last week in anticipation of President Trump's tour of the Middle East. They reached a deal, which has really yet to be fully realized. A lot of cargo ships have still redirected their course around the Red Sea just because they don't trust the Houthis. And this deal excluded Israel, and it also excluded the UK. And I think Israel was not too happy with that and the sidelining very publicly of Israel in the negotiations with the Houthis, as well as to release Idan Alexander, I think was noted by everyone on the world stage. And that was also a departure from how President Trump has typically or historically approached the region and our alliance with Israel. And despite the U.S. reaching a deal with the Houthis, again, that sidestepped Israel, our key ally in the region, the only democracy in the Middle East. The Houthis targeted Israel while President Trump was in Saudi Arabia. So quite literally from the Red Sea, these missiles went over President Trump's head in Saudi Arabia, targeting the interior of Israel. And so I would caution the current administration from deeming that agreement a success, because the power of the United States as the global hegemon should not only yield an outcome favorable to United States interests, but also the interest of our allies, which includes Israel. And again, that sidestepping of Israel or not including Israel in that conversation, I think is a dangerous shift in how President Trump has historically regarded the region. And again, Israel and the United States are not a package deal. The United States needs to enact foreign policy abroad that is in our interest first. But because Iran and its proxy network, the Houthis and Hamas, are intrinsically linked to chaos in the region, as well as the war between Israel and Hamas and our interests that lie there, and the fact that Iran calls the U.S. the big Satan and Israel is the little Satan, and there's a joint effort to export the revolution and destroy both the small Satan, Israel first, and then the United States, that Israel should have been involved in these talks. So again, there's not a package deal here, but there should be strings attached for our interests abroad, which do still lie with Israel. And of course, tensions reportedly have emerged between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. There was also reports that Mike Witkoff was telling the hostage families that the Israeli government is continuing a needless war in Gaza. Again, that wasn't officially on the record, but that was what was reported back by hostage families. And so we're seeing some diverging on the official narrative and on the joint front that President Trump had adopted initially within his first few weeks in office during a second term, which was a united front with Israel. And reportedly, this was in a Newsweek article. This was probably off the record. I couldn't find the original source. Hamas is overjoyed, of course, at the apparent dissension, or at least the lack of communication and organization between the United States and Israel when it comes to U.S. foreign policy emerging in the region. So the article claims to quote a senior Hamas official. Let's get this advertisement on the way. A senior Hamas official tells Newsweek that the Palestinian militant group saw positive potential in signs of a growing rift between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, after offering the U.S. leader a political win in the form of an American hostage release ahead of his Middle East trip. Again, the Houthi deal, as well as the release of Idan Alexander, was done without any involvement and talks with Israel. And this is in quotes, apparently quoting this Hamas political bureau member. Given the unlimited support of the American administration for the entity being Israel, any disagreement between them would certainly be a positive development that would weaken Netanyahu's stubborn position and open the door to the possibility of reaching an agreement to end the war. This is specifically true since the continuation of the war does not serve Trump's strategic projects in the region. And to that end, this purported Hamas political bureau member is correct. If Trump's ambitions are to turn towards the Gulf states, an official end to the war, as well as an official Palestinian state, has always been the precondition for increased involvement between the United States and the Gulf states. And so if this is true, this does signal a positive shift for Hamas, or at least from their current position. When it comes to the release of Idan Alexander, obviously this is joyous. I cannot imagine. He was kidnapped at the age of 19. He is now 21 years old, and he was in captivity for over a year and a half. So his release is an absolute joy, and it was welcomed by both America and Israel. But again, this occurred in a unilateral conversation between the United States and Qatar. This release was meant to buy favor with the United States ahead of Trump's visit, and the negotiation between the United States and Hamas via Qatar. Again, because Qatar is the official and the palatable talking piece or talking, head for Hamas. They fund Hamas billions of dollars, but yet they still try and play both sides of the fence. But if you look under the covers, it's quite clear that Qatar plays a very strategic and authoritative role with Hamas. And so they sidestep Israel, as I mentioned. But I think it's also important to point out that Qatar has the power, as they demonstrated with the release of Idan, to release all of the hostages, or to demand the release of all the hostages and strong arm Hamas into doing so. But their interests aren't humanitarian, they're not altruistic. This release was simply strategic for Qatar. But it's also important to point out that the power the United States yields in the world and the region should also be enough to release all of the hostages. All it would have taken for both President Biden or President Trump would have been, hey, Qatar, release all of the hostages, strong arm Hamas into doing so, incentivize it, tell them, or we are removing the U.S. airbase in Qatar. And if there was a strings attached kind of ultimatum given to Qatar, I think we would see the hostages released. So again, a little bit disheartened that there wasn't a push for more than one hostage being released ahead of President Trump's visit. All right, and that gets us to this plane. President Trump, in anticipation of going to Qatar, was there. He made brokered a huge deal between Boeing, which is based in Seattle. It's a US-based company. Boeing, all of us fly on a Boeing airplane likely, or an Airbus airplane when we fly anywhere around the country or the world. So he brokered a deal between Boeing and Qatar for $96 billion for some 210 airplanes. So this is a huge deal. This will no doubt boost the U.S. economy. But with this deal came the gifting of a $400 million luxury plane to President Trump to be accepted by the United States. So there was initial outrage. How can President Trump accept a $400 million plane? He came out on Truth Social and said, on the record, this plane is a gift to the United States. He didn't address the fact that the intention would then be after his term to donate it to the Trump Library, which then would make this a personal plane. And also the fact that to retrofit this plane to Air Force standards or to Secret Service standards to be Air Force One or to operate as Air Force One is going to cost the US taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars, and it would probably take about 2 years. Okay, so President Trump accepts this plane, and we immediately see division, even within the right, over him accepting the plane. A ton of people are like, well, what's the problem? He accepts the plane. That's incredible. It's just a gift to show Qatar's gratitude for us. And let me be really clear. Any gift that is worth $400 million is, again, not altruistic. It comes with strings attached. This is lobbying at its most luxurious form. And we're going to get into all of the billions of dollars, the hundreds of billions of dollars that Qatar has put into the United States to lobby and to reshape their public image. Again, every American should ask, well, to what end? Why would Qatar invest $100 billion into the United States? Why would they offer a $400 million plane to the United States to serve as Air Force One? And very rarely do big gifts like this or big investments into a foreign nation come with no strings attached. And so my question in this video is, what are those demands that come with these gifts? Okay, so the official narrative, or what people seem to popularly believe, is that Qatar is a top American ally, that they have been an American ally, and that this is a gift for gratitude for that alliance. So Qatar does host a U.S. military base. They inherited it from Saudi Arabia, but they also host the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's been absent from the official narrative. They also house, or Qatar serves as the home, Doha serves as the home, or did serve as the home, they've been eliminated by Israel, of the top 3 Hamas political bureau heads. 3 of them combined worth $100 billion. And Qatar is the largest funder of Hamas and of money going into Gaza. So all of that was not addressed by the official White House narrative in receiving this plane. Another really interesting thing I've noticed emerge is Republicans immediately getting defensive of President Trump and asking, like, what is the big deal? And I hope in this video you at least critically assess what the implications of this might mean. And I don't want to be prescriptive as to what accepting this plane means or what might be the shift in Trump's Middle East policy. I don't want to be prescriptive. I don't think that it's come into focus yet. The whole point of this video is to ask, what might some of the demands from Qatar be in light of all of their foreign investment into the United States and in light of this gift to the United States in the form of a $400 million plane. So one of the arguments on the right that has emerged is, well, should we give back the Statue of Liberty? And I want to correct that very popular narrative that has been popularized on X and on Instagram by your average everyday American. The Statue of Liberty was gifted from France to the United States to say thank you for our long alliance. Number one, France is another member of the West. They are a democracy. We share shared values of freedom, human rights, but also they helped us achieve independence from the British. Like, our alliance with them goes back to the Revolutionary War. And the statue, aside from the materials it's made of, has no other monetary value. It's like essentially a piece of art. It's whatever we place its value, that's what it's worth. But it's an object that serves kind of as a symbol from another Western nation. It's not a $400 million luxury airplane from a non-Western state that has direct ties with Islamist and jihadist movements in the region. So it's a little bit different. The implications are a lot different. And again, when you're lobbying the United States government to favor your vision for the region or to favor the Qatari government or Qatari economy, that's very different. That's active lobbying. That's not a inanimate object being gifted to the United States to sit in front of Ellis Island as a symbol of our mutual interest and friendship. So this is not like the Statue of Liberty. Okay, so let's get into how Trump responded. So Trump tweeted this about the plane. He said, so the fact that The Defense Department is getting a gift. A gift is in caps, also in caps, is free of charge, of a 747 aircraft to replace the 40-year-old Air Force One temporarily until it goes to live or be used by the Trump library, is a very public and transparent transaction. So, brothers, the crooked Democrats, that they insist we pay top dollar for the plane, anybody can do that. The Dems are world-class losers, MAGA. Okay. I want to address the free of charge. A $400 million plane is not free of charge. It comes with strings attached. Okay, so the Free Press has been one of the only publications that has written about this. And I think this goes back to Qatar's influence in the United States and how they have bought interest in almost every legacy media company. Okay, so here they talk about a $400 million gift in the form of a plane. So again, this goes over the plane would first be used as Air Force One, and then it would be gifted to the Trump library. But what the beginning of the article also, I think, brings to light is how many Republicans felt about Hunter Biden leveraging his family for business dealings with China and Ukraine. And it goes on to talk about how the Trump real estate enterprise, ahead of President Trump's official state visit to the Middle East, engaged in some big real estate deals, including Eric Trump's visit to Doha for a deal that includes a luxury golf resort worth $5.5 billion. And I'll link this article down below. It goes into some other business dealings that involve Qatar. So it's becoming apparent that the Trump family's interest, their private company's interest, are now somehow intertwined with President Trump and his policy or his regional policy abroad. And I don't want to make any big moral argument or claim here, but other than to say that the optics of Trump's sons engaging in private business dealings in Qatar and then accepting a $400 million plane from the Qatari government accepted by the US government, the optics don't look great. And again, there are some positives to this, that being President Trump is likely to want a peaceful Middle East, which he wanted in his first term, exported through maybe not even military assurances, but economic interdependence. I think that's a great route moving forward. And because President Trump's business dealings will be intertwined with Qatar, it will influence his foreign policy in the region to at least pursue peaceful resolution. So in that way, it does benefit the American public as well. A Democrat from New York, I believe he is a congressman, he wrote, and I thought that this was powerful. It has a deeply troubling history, speaking of Qatar, of financing a barbaric terrorist organization that has the blood of Americans on its hands. In the cruelest irony, Air Force One will have something in common with Hamas. It's paid for by Qatar. And I think that at the end of the day, that's why the optics of accepting the airplane look really, really bad. I just would love to encourage the Trump administration to maybe step back and reassess how those optics might play out and what that might signal to other actors in the region or even abroad, including China, who is our biggest adversary, what that means when there seems to be a shift from Israel, our greatest ally, which has been the Trump administration's official position in the region, to the Gulf states. There was this Free Press article because a lot of people are debating the legality of President Trump accepting this plane. And essentially in the article, it lays out that it's probably lawful for the United States as a nation to accept this plane, but it's probably unlawful for President Trump to then accept this to the Trump Presidential Library. And this article also just points out, which is something else I immediately thought of when the news of the plane hit, which was, is this a Trojan horse? There's a lot of security concerns when it comes to our commander-in-chief flying around in a plane that was once in the possession of an Arab state that has backed many other terrorist entities in the region. So there is a direct military and security concern when it comes to that. I know when it's retrofitted, it will probably be completely renovated on the inside, but even just like the hardware of the plane, not saying that there is something in the plane, but again, is this a Trojan horse? I think that there is legitimate security concerns when it comes to that. Again, this was once in the possession of Qatar that funds Hamas. And so two things really can't be true at once, even though Qatar likes to straddle the fence, which is that it's pro-West, it's pro-United States. It puts on this very diplomatic front, but then behind closed doors, it's funding Iran, it's funding Hamas, it has ties to jihadists in the region. Their objectives on playing both sides doesn't really have an outcome that in actuality favors the West. So even though their official rhetoric is friendly towards the United States, their actions in funding Islamist organizations in the region contradict that external official policy position of Qatar. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at, actually, let's look at Bill's tweet really quick. Bill Ackman had this tweet, which I thought was great. He said, "Why is it not okay for the DoD to accept a $400 million plane from Qatar, but it is okay for our elite universities to accept billions from Qatar? How is one proper and the other is not?" Just asking. And then he goes on to clarify, to be clear, he opposes both. And he put out this tweet as well, which I think is great. So he's replying to someone because I think his initial tweet was confusing. He said, "I am obviously aware of the issues associated with our president accepting a $400 million aircraft to be used to replace Air Force One. For these reasons, some of which you cite in your post, I am opposed to our country accepting this, quote, gift from Qatar. I am also highly aware of the serious risk to our country of having foreign governments be massive benefactors of our universities, especially our elite colleges that have traditionally educated the next generation of leadership of our nation, our institutions, our judiciary, our media, and other seats of power and influence in our country." One of the biggest schools that Qatar funds is Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He goes on to say, "The radicalization of our students and their support for terrorists as exhibited on campus over the last 20 months speaks to the seriousness of this risk." He's speaking to Qatar really funding this anti-West agenda happening on American universities in support of Hamas, outwardly supporting Hamas, and speaking out against the West in America and Israel, which is why I use the AF1 example to ask a rhetorical question, aforementioned. I was not advocating in favor of our government accepting a replacement to Air Force One from a foreign government. I was pointing out the problems with foreign government influence in our universities and the hypocrisy of those who criticize the airplane gift while remaining silent or even supportive of foreign government funding and influence over our universities and our potential future leaders. I agree with him completely, but what I'm actually interested in is the inverse of his last paragraph. I think it is also extremely ironic that you have individuals, including the official Trump administration's position on foreign students, advocating for Hamas on our college campuses, i.e. Mahmoud Khalil, and deporting Mahmoud Khalil, and then going to Qatar and accepting a $400 million plane. That domestic policy position on the radicalization of our American universities, and then going to Qatar and accepting such a large gift from a foreign entity that is funding that chaos on our university campuses, is not a compatible policy position. It's inconsistent. And just to revisit, when talking about Mahmoud Khalil, who was deported for being a pro-Hamas sympathizer, it was justified through this executive order that President signed when he immediately took office, which was protecting the United States from foreign terrorists and other national security and public safety threats. And to be clear, I completely support the deportation of foreign students who hold student visas or even green cards, come to the United States, have the privilege of studying at our most elite universities while using their extracurricular time to advocate for Hamas, a Islamist jihadist terrorist organization, and the destruction of not just Israel, but Israel as a symbol for the West and the United States as well. And a quote from this executive order is, sorry, let's go here, that anyone will be deported. In order to protect Americans, the United States must be vigilant during the visa insurance process to ensure that those aliens approved for admissions into the United States do not intend to harm Americans or our national interest. More importantly, the United States must identify them before their admissions or entry into the United States. And the United States must ensure that admitted aliens and aliens otherwise already present in the United States do not bear hostile attitudes towards its citizens, culture, government, institutions, or founding principles. and do not advocate for, aid, or support designated foreign terrorists and other threats to our national security. The last part being extremely alarming in light of this shift towards the Gulf states, particularly Qatar, who do directly fund billions of dollars worth of money alone to support Hamas, which is a designated foreign terrorist entity. And not just to fund Hamas, but to operate through Al Jazeera, their official state-run media, an entire anti-Israel campaign. And Al Jazeera, which is the Qatar-funded state media, has been banned in a handful of even Arab states in the region, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and Jordan, because they're very aware of how that media entity, that outlet, is used to radicalize populations in favor of Islamist agendas. And a lot of these countries, aware of how Qatar uses that as a mechanism, have banned it in their countries. And also, let's remember that Al Jazeera was on the scene and took place in what happened on October 7th. So again, I'm trying to build a case that Qatar is not above reproach. It can't really appeal to plausible deniability. If you look, I mean, Qatar and their puppeteering of Washington, D.C. is like one of the open secrets of Washington, D.C., primarily because Qatar has its funding both on the right and on the left. And there's an incredible piece that was published in the Free Press just 2 days ago on how Qatar bought America. The tiny Gulf nation has spent almost $100 billion to establish its influence in Congress, universities, newsrooms, think tanks, corporations. What does it want in return? And again, that question applies to what does it want in return of a $400 million plane? And what does the United States seek to do? Is it leveraging this plane for talks with Iran? That might be a possibility. But what is the Trump administration's goal in accepting this plane in light of the negative optics when it comes to Qatar? Okay, so this article goes through and extensively highlights all of the ways in which Qatar has its hands in the media. Here is a video that the Free Press just put out. It's talking about how an MSNBC news anchor was flown to Qatar to ask Qatari officials really softball questions about the country. And they use this as an example of how Qatar has funded a huge campaign in the West to reimagine its brand and also to divert the West's attention of its terrorist activity and funding terrorists towards other more positive initiatives such as economic initiatives, academic initiatives in the United States as well. And I want to draw a parallel between what the reporter from the Free Press is talking about when it comes to the establishment media with the rise of new media and individuals such as Tucker Carlson, who are puppeting a very similar official kind of position on Qatar that the establishment media does.
To interview the U.S. ambassador to Qatar about how great Qatar is at an event hosted by Qatar. And it was just, we were like, is he getting paid for this?
The issue of Qatar and its role does come up, some of the misconceptions.
It turns out he's not like getting directly paid, but they all acknowledge that the Sufan Center, which was like the official host of it, and they've got tie-ups.
So talking about this MSNBC anchor who's going to Qatar to ask questions, and it was such an odd line of questioning that they're like, is he getting paid to do this? And they aren't able to directly link him to being paid monetarily, but he was flown over, like he says, probably in business class, probably put up in an extremely lavish hotel. And the Sufan Center was the host of this. And this reporter goes on to talk about how, and he's the author of the piece I just highlighted on Qatar, how his wife also serves on the board of this center. So they're drawing connections together that even if it's not direct influences, and here's $100,000, come to Qatar and talk about how great we are, there are still benefits. And this is all constituted as lobbying.
With the Qatari government. They paid his way. We assume it was business class, put up in a hotel. They hosted an event for his book party. His wife, it turns out, is on the board of the Sufan Center. And you can just like, wow, look how intertwined these major media outlets are with a foreign government.
Okay, so I'm going to link that video in the description box down below. I really highly encourage you to go look at it. But I want to point out how Tucker Carlson, about a month ago, had the Prime Minister of Qatar on his podcast. and it's had 1 million views. The title was War with Iran. The Prime Minister of Qatar is being attacked in the media for wanting to stop it. Again, they fund Iran. So this is like having a mouthpiece from Iran, essentially talking about how great Iran is. And in this interview, Tucker Carlson sits back in a very similar way to what the approach he took with Putin when he visited Russia, and just sat back and did that whole like fake wonderment bit that he does where he asks, well, is Iran actually really that bad? They tell us in the West that Iran is horrible, kind of like they used to tell us about how Iraq was horrible and that they have weapons of mass destruction. And is this just another neocon, position to try and bait us into another war so that neocons can make millions and millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars? In the description, it says there's an enormous pressure on the United States to participate in a brand new war against Iran. And again, Tucker Carlson's whole image is talking about how we shouldn't worry about other countries' interests abroad. We shouldn't intervene. The government of Qatar thinks that's unwise. Yeah, well, no duh. So, of course, they're being slaughtered relentlessly in the American media. It couldn't be because Qatar is just like the official funder or mouthpiece for Iran in the region. They share interests with Iran ideologically. It couldn't be because of that they're getting bashed in the media. It has to be some sort of elite agenda. And then the further implication of that is that it's a Zionist agenda, an Israeli agenda to try and pit the West against Iran, their biggest enemy, so that the West does Israel's bidding. That's essentially what Tucker Carlson is arguing in this, which couldn't be further from the truth. But again, it makes me wonder, and I think it's very appropriate to wonder, why Tucker Carlson's position on war and the region has greatly shifted almost overnight, and why he is puppeting an official narrative that looks a lot like MSNBC and CNN and other think tanks and organizations that are bought off by Qatar and influenced by them. And to just have the Qatari prime minister come on and not ask a single hard-hitting question and sit back and let him paint a revisionist history of Qatar and the region really makes me wonder where Tucker Carlson's interests lie. And what I mean by that is he also being funded by Qatar, or has he been given favors by Qatar to lobby him towards this official narrative? And again, Tucker Carlson has built his platform on an anti-elitist, anti-government institution agenda, a just asking questions agenda that seeks to reveal how our government is actually run. And maybe Winston Churchill was actually the villain of World War II. And maybe it's actually the Zionists and AIPAC that are funding our government and puppeteering our politicians to favor wars that protect Israel. And so I would not be surprised if there was some sort of direct funding between Tucker Carlson and Qatari interest. Because when he's peddling like an official Qatari government narrative without any dissenting, without any hard-hitting question, I think it's appropriate for the audience to ask why. And again, if he has an anti-elitist agenda, but he converges on the same talking point as the legacy media, claiming to represent the new media, then you have to wonder who is funding this united front when it comes to Qatar. And also when it comes to hating the Jews. Have you noticed that? The legacy media and the new media, the woke right, talking heads, the commentators, and the left, the establishment media, have these same talking points on Qatar and on the Jews. That's interesting. Who's funding that when their policy interests diverge on about everything else? And then the last thing I want to point out, which I already kind of talked about this with Mahmoud Khalil, is that Qatar is the biggest funder of American universities. To date, they have invested $6.3 billion into our education system. And the Trump administration has focused a lot of its domestic efforts on countering anti-Semitism across our American universities. And so I would just encourage the Trump administration to take a step back and look at the through lines that Qatar has its hand in all of this, and that they are calling through the radicalization of our own American university students and their very intricate media campaign in the West to destroy the West and the values that his executive order claims to uphold. So again, taking a step back, I don't want to be too prescriptive. I don't know if this is just a play in President Trump's Middle East and also the negotiations coming up with Iran. But again, the optics of accepting a $400 million plane from Qatar in light of all of its manipulation in our media and in our university systems for an anti-Western narrative doesn't look great. having Trump Enterprise going to Qatar and embarking on a $5.5 billion deal in the lead up to his official state visit, President Trump, again, his sons are acting separate from him, but their interests are no doubtably intertwined. Even though President Trump has officially stepped down from his business, the Trump name and the Trump legacy is still very much intertwined with him. And so that doesn't look very good for optics either. And I would just caution the Trump administration from shifting from the legacy of the Abraham Accords and its first administration's policy of trying to normalize the Arab states with Israel. And I fear that his second term foreign policy being influenced by isolationists, including his son, Don Jr., who tends to prescribe to that line of thinking, is shifting how he even discussed Israel within the first month of his second term. And his vision of the new Middle East from this last week of him in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the speeches that he's made seems to be shifting from a region focused on normalizing with Israel to one of economic infrastructure and interdependence with the Gulf states. And again, Israel and the Gulf states have historically not been two objectives that are intertwined. And so I caution the current administration and even Republicans, if you consider yourself MAGA, to look inward, look at some of the ideological contradictions, look at how Qatar undermines our security and Western values, and critically look at how this shift towards the Gulf states away from Israel might be dangerous for American interests. All right. With that, I will leave you. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the Philos Project channel. And I will see you in the next episode.